Did he go elsewhere? What was his role?
Well, that's a really good question. So what happened as soon as Pearl Harbor happened, and I guess this is probably indicative of Hull's relationship with Grew and his regard for Grew. So here it is, this attack occurs, but Roosevelt and Hull learn about it around 1:40 p.m. on December 7th in Washington, D.C. Nobody bothers to tell Grew that Pearl Harbor has been attacked. And he did not learn about it until hours after it had occurred. And the only way Grew heard about it was because a San Francisco radio station was reporting it, and they picked it up on a shortwave radio, as I say, many hours after it had occurred. In any event, as soon as Pearl Harbor occurred, or right shortly after it occurred, the Japanese arrested Grew and the other members of the embassy staff, and they were all held as prisoners of war. And they were held in the American embassy, and they were held there until arrangements could be made between the United States and Japan for an exchange of diplomatic personnel, so that the Japanese representatives in the United States would be returned to Japan, and the American representatives in Japan would be returned to the United States. But that negotiation for that exchange took 6 months. And during that 6 months, Grew wrote a report that detailed his criticisms of American policy in the months before Pearl Harbor. And Grew planned to give that report. It was 60 pages. He planned to give that report to Hull and to President Roosevelt upon his return to the United States. And so Grew finally came back to Washington, D.C. in August of 1942. And he had drafted a letter to Roosevelt in which he was going to give Roosevelt a copy of this report that was critical of American policy. But first he had to show it to Cordell Hull, who's not only Secretary of State, but as Secretary of State, he was, of course, Grew's supervisor, because Grew was part of the State Department. So Grew went to meet Hull at his office. It was August 25th or August 26th, 1942. And he showed Hull a copy of this report that he wanted to formally give to Hull and also give to Roosevelt. And Hull, we can get into Hull's personality, but Hull was a person who grew up in Tennessee and had a man of extreme moral judgments. And he glanced through this report and saw that this report that Grew had prepared was very critical of decisions and statements which Hull had made in the months leading up before the Pearl Harbor attack. And Hull became very angry. And he told Grew that he had to destroy that report. And if he did not destroy the report, Hull would make it public. And then he said, well, let the public decide who is right or wrong about American policy in the months before Pearl Harbor. Well, Grew said, we can't have this report made public. This is 1942. We're in the middle of a war, and the last thing we have to be unified as a nation. I don't want to be part of something that's going to be divisive. And so ultimately, Grew acceded to Hull's demand that the report be destroyed. And so he destroyed this report, and he never gave it to Roosevelt. And Grew never publicly acknowledged that he had destroyed this report that was critical of American policy, even when he was asked about it in a post-war congressional hearing, when members of Congress asked him if he had submitted any report to Hull upon his return to the United States.
Does any part of this report survive?
Not that I know of. I could not find it in Grew's papers. And in fact, I have a letter that Grew wrote when, in 1950, in response to a question from a University of Chicago history professor who was asking about Grew's reports. And in that letter, Grew acknowledged that he had destroyed this report at Hull's request. And in fact, the irony, the sad thing is that Grew's private secretary, who was very familiar with the report, this private secretary spent years looking for the report because he knew about it, but he did not know that Grew had destroyed it. And he spent literally decades looking in vain for this report that Grew had prepared. But Grew did publish his memoirs about his years as a diplomat and in Japan, and in that memoir, which came out in 1952, he expounded on his criticisms of American policy in the months before Pearl Harbor.
Hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors. Well, here's the big question with all of this, and I suppose I'll roll two questions into one. What are the lessons of Grew? And also, it's easy to dismiss him because, in a way, all's well that ends well, in the sense that after World War II, the United States wins with the Marshall Plan. Japan is transformed from a fascist imperial nation into a staunch ally for the decades to come and up to today. So what are the lessons of Grew, and what would have happened if he would have been able to negotiate a peace? Would there a cold allyship or an armistice with the Great East Asia co-prosperity sphere that would have continued to exist? Would Japan have hopefully transformed into something more benign than what it was in the 30s and 40s? So what are the lessons of Grew, and do you think we have the best result that could have happened, or could something better have happened?
Well, let me take that second question first. It's so hard to speculate. Hindsight's an uncertain tool in trying to figure out what should have been done or what the possibilities were. Certainly where we are today with Japan, who can argue with the result, where Japan is a good ally, I think, and the Japanese government has been transformed, and so it's a good result. But of course, the price for that result was considerable. Thousands of Americans died. Thousands more were injured, and with injuries that changed their lives. So a lot of American blood was shed to achieve the result we have today. Could that have been avoided? I guess I would answer it this way. Grew certainly thought so. I mean, that's what his whole driving force was. So he believed that there was some way to achieve an harmonious relationship with Japan that would not require loss of thousands of American lives. And you have to remember, too, when he was doing this, he didn't know about the atomic bomb. But before the atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, the United States was planning a land invasion of Japan that the military chiefs expected would result in hundreds of thousands of American casualties, which were avoided by the dropping of the atomic bombs. So I'm not sure. It's hard to speculate. People can argue all day long about, well, it was an American sacrifice and we got a good result, and you can argue about whether it was worth it or whether there was some other alternative. But I do think, in response to your first question, I do think there are lessons to be learned from Grew's experience and from America's experience in dealing with Japan, and that is the use of sanctions, economic sanctions. Still today, and not just today, but for a long time, the United States government oftentimes believes that imposing economic sanctions is a way to shape the policy of another country, a foreign country that seems to be bent on war. And that if we apply sanctions, that we're going to bring these countries to their knees. And I think the experience we had with Japan shows that these people oftentimes have a different mindset. As I go back to what I had mentioned before, Grew said that Japan was prepared to launch a suicidal war because for them, annihilation was better than succumbing to American pressure. There was this matter of pride. And Grew tried to say, and did say to Hull and to Roosevelt, he said, it might seem foolhardy. It might seem stupid to you that a country would risk annihilation rather than trying to accede to the American sanctions. He said, but Japanese logic can't be measured by standards of Western logic. They have a logic that's different than ours, and you can't make judgments and decisions based upon Western logic and think that other countries share our way of thinking. And I think that applies today and has lessons for us today, whether it be in North Korea or Iran or other countries. You can't say that, well, we're so concerned with material comforts. If a country's economy is crippled, as Japan's was, by American economic sanctions, they'll do what we want. Well, they may not, because for them, other considerations may be more important. Pride, as it was in the case of Japan, may play a stronger role in shaping the policy of those other foreign governments than material comforts. So I think we have to bear that in mind in trying to decide what's going to influence another country's policies.
Well, definitely a historical analysis that has a lot of contemporary resonance with what's happening today geopolitically. Absolutely. So the book is In the Cauldron, Terror, Tension, and the American Ambassador's Struggle to Avoid Pearl Harbor. Lew, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks very much. I enjoyed it.
All right. Well, that wraps up our exploration of the past for this episode. First off, I want to give a shout out to the Spy Masters for the Knowlton's Rangers. Vic Austin, Chris, Rob Matlock, Alan Baker, Beverly Engel, Jake Harrington, Todd Warren, William Ivey, Joyce Normant, Tyler from Colorado, Josh Reddick, Daniel Lawson, Marlene, Michael, Tim Clark, David Powell, Moondoggy from Ohio, Melissa, Christopher Main, Carl from Norway, and Baron Fraser. I'll explain what that is in a second. If you like the show and want to help it grow, there are 4 easy ways for you to do it. 1, like and subscribe to the show on the podcast player of your choice. This helps spread the word about the show. 2, join our Facebook group. Here we can keep the discussion going about new episodes, and you can talk about what you like and didn't like. And you can find this group if you just search for History Unplugged on Facebook. 3, we have an online store with t-shirts, phone covers, and other accessories featuring awesomely bad history puns that were crowdsourced by you, the audience. And you can find that if you go to tpublic, public.com and look for History Unplugged, or you just go to historyonthenet.com and look for our store there. 4, and this is really the best way to dive deep with History Unplugged, and that's to become one of the Knowlton's Rangers. If you know your American history, you know the Knowlton's Rangers were an elite spy and reconnaissance group in the American Revolutionary War, but it's also the name of the membership program of History Unplugged. You can join at 3 levels. If you join at the level of Scout, you can hear all the episodes of History Unplugged completely ad-free and get early access to new episodes, at least a week early. If you join at the Intelligence Officer level, you get special bonus episodes, like a 10-part series on the World War II hero Audie Murphy, a multi-part series called Ottoman Lives about different people in the Ottoman Empire, and a series called Rendezvous with Death that looks at biographical profiles of Americans who went to fight in World War I before America entered the war. The last level is Spy Master, where you get all that stuff, but you also get 3 hardcover history books, Forging a President, How the Wild West Created Teddy Roosevelt, Race to the Top of the World, Richard Byrd and the First Flight to the North Pole, and The Last Fighter Pilot, the true story of the final combat mission of World War II. Another bonus is, you can choose a history topic for me to focus on for an entire episode that can go up to an hour, and I'll answer whatever question you have for me, and you get a shout out at the end of each episode. If you want to learn how to become a member of the Knowlton's Rangers, go to patreon.com/unplugged. That's patreon.com/unplugged. All right, well, that is all for my spiel. Thanks for listening to the History Unplugged podcast, from ancient Greece to the Cold War and everything else in between. See you next time.